The massive amphitheater buzzed with alien voices as students from 12 different worlds settled into their seats. Professor Vextala clicked her forearms together, a gesture that meant attention in her species. The insectoid teacher stood nearly 7 feet tall, her compound eyes reflecting the holographic displays that surrounded the circular classroom. Captain James Mitchell adjusted his position in the back row, trying not to draw attention to himself. As the only human at the Galactic Military Academy, he'd learned to observe quietly during these lectures. The alien cadets barely acknowledged his presence most days, which suited him fine. Today felt different, though. Today they were discussing weapons. "Welcome to Advanced Xenoarchaeology," Professor Vextal announced, her voice carrying a slight, buzzing quality. "Today we examine the primitive warfare tools of pre-faster-than-light civilizations." The first hologram appeared, a crude stone axe from the Gordian homeworld. Several students yawned. Next came a bronze sword from the Altarian colonies. A few more displays followed, each weapon earning dismissive clicks from the professor. "As you can observe," Vextala continued, "these early species relied on basic materials and simple physics. Most barely understood metallurgy when they achieved spaceflight." Cadet Korax shifted in his reinforced seat, his massive frame making the metal creak. The reptilian warrior stood nearly 8 feet tall, his thick scales gleaming on the classroom lights. His species, the Thevirians, were known throughout the galaxy as natural-born fighters. Their hide could deflect most energy weapons, making them valuable as shock troops. "Now we come to Earth," the professor said, her tone shifting to barely concealed amusement. "The humans present an interesting case study in primitive thinking." Mitchell felt his jaw tighten but remained silent. Around the room, alien students leaned forward with renewed interest. Everyone had heard stories about humans, the newcomers who'd somehow fought their way into galactic society despite lacking proper technology. The hologram shifted to display a simple wooden bow, not even a compound design, just curved with a string. Several students actually laughed out loud. "Behold," Vextala announced dramatically, "the pinnacle of human innovation, a stick that bends." More laughter rippled through the amphitheater. Cadet Xylov, a blue-skinned Viridian, raised her webbed hand. "Professor, surely humans developed energy weapons before achieving space travel?" "Surprisingly, no," Vextala replied. "They reached their moon using chemical rockets and were still throwing pointed sticks at each other. Most remarkable." Mitchell watched Korax's reaction carefully. The big reptilian was grinning, showing rows of sharp teeth. His species took pride in their combat prowess, and the idea of humans using such basic tools clearly amused him. "I find this hard to believe," Korax rumbled, his voice like grinding stone. "Even our younglings use plasma weapons for hunting. How did such a primitive species survive long enough for space travel?" "An excellent question," the professor replied. "Human records suggest they used these weapons for thousands of years. They seem quite attached to the concept." The hologram shifted again, showing a compound bow this time, sleek, modern, with cables and pulleys. But to the alien students, it still looked laughably primitive compared to their energy weapons. "This is their advanced version," Vextala explained. "Notice the complex pulley system. Humans actually considered this sophisticated technology." Cadet Thissa, a crystalline being from the Stellar Confederacy, chimed in with her melodic voice. "What kind of damage could such a weapon possibly cause? Our personal shields would stop any projectile." "Minimal, I would assume," the professor replied. "The kinetic energy output appears quite limited compared to modern standards." Korax stood up suddenly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Professor, with respect, I don't believe these weapons could harm any modern soldier. My natural armor has deflected direct plasma hits. A wooden stick with string poses no threat." Mitchell felt every eye in the room turn toward him. The challenge was clear, even if unspoken. He'd been the subject of whispers and speculation since arriving at the academy 3 months ago. Some students wondered how primitive humans had earned a place among the galactic powers. Others assumed humans were kept around for entertainment value. Professor Vextala's compound eyes glittered with what Mitchell recognized as mischief. Perhaps our human guest would care to demonstrate the effectiveness of these weapons? Captain Mitchell, would you honor us with practical lesson? The amphitheater fell silent. 200 alien students turned to stare at the lone human in the back row. Mitchell could feel their amusement, their curiosity, their barely contained contempt. They wanted to see the primitive human play with his stick and string. Mitchell stood slowly, his hand moving to the equipment case beside his chair. "I'd be happy to demonstrate, Professor." Captain Mitchell walked down the amphitheater steps with measured confidence, his boots echoing in the sudden quiet. Every alien I tracked his movement as he reached his equipment case. The reinforced container looked ordinary enough, but Mitchell had packed it carefully before leaving Earth. Inside lay examples of human warfare spanning millennia, just in case situations like this arose. He lifted out a sleek compound bow that gleamed under classroom lights. Unlike the primitive wooden bow in a hologram, this weapon represented centuries of human engineering. Carbon fiber limbs curved gracefully from a machine aluminum riser. Steel cables ran through precisely calculated pulley systems. Every component had been designed for one purpose: delivering maximum force with deadly accuracy. "This particular design traces back roughly 15,000 years, Mitchell said, his voice carrying easily through the amphitheater. "We've made some improvements since then." A wave of chittering laughter swept through the alien students. To them, 15,000 years might as well have been yesterday. Most of their civilizations had been using energy weapons for hundreds of thousands of years. The idea that humans still clung to such ancient technology struck them as either quaint or pathetic. Cadet Corax descended from his seat, each step making the floor vibrate slightly. Up close, the reptilian warrior looked even more imposing. His scales weren't just thick, they were layered like natural body armor, each one overlapping the next in perfect defensive formation. Scars from training exercises marked his hide, proof that he'd faced real weapons and survived. "I've been hit by plasma bolts during combat training," Corax announced proudly, flexing his massive arms. "The instructors had to increase power settings just to make me feel it. My scales can stop anything your primitive weapon could possibly throw." Mitchell nodded respectfully while running his fingers along the bow's limbs, checking for any stress fractures. "Your species has impressive natural defenses," he agreed. "Very practical evolution." Professor Vextala clicked her approval from the front of the room. This demonstration would provide valuable data for her research. She'd already activated recording devices, eager to document the limitations of human technology for future lectures. "Please proceed, Captain," she said. "We're all quite curious to observe this ancient hunting tool in action." The other students buzzed with excitement. Cadet Thissa whispered something to her neighbor in her crystalline language. Several Viridian students had started taking bets on whether the human weapon would even leave a mark. The consensus seemed to be that Corax wouldn't feel anything at all. Mitchell opened another compartment of his case, revealing rows of arrows secured in foam padding. Each one had been crafted for specific purposes: target points for practice, field points for small game, and something else entirely. His fingers hovered over selection before choosing a particular arrow that looked different from the rest. "What type of projectile is that?" asked Cadet Xylov, her blue skin rippling with curiosity. "We call it broadhead," Mitchell replied, holding up the arrow for examination. The point wasn't a simple spike. It consisted of multiple razor-sharp blades arranged in a cone formation. Each blade had been honed to surgical sharpness and designed to slice through whatever it encountered. Corax snorted dismissively. "Tiny metal points? My scales have turned aside military-grade cutting tools. Your little arrow tips won't even scratch the surface." Mitchell clipped the arrow to his bow string and took his position. The compound bow felt familiar in his hands. He'd been practicing with similar weapons since childhood. Every human military officer learned traditional weapons alongside modern ones. It was considered part of their heritage, though most aliens assumed it was just nostalgic foolishness. "How far should I stand?" Corax asked, spreading his arms wide. "I want to give your weapon every possible advantage." 20 meters should be sufficient," Mitchell replied, checking his sight alignment. The reptilian cadet walked to the designated distance and turned to face the human. His confidence radiated through every gesture. Around the amphitheater, alien students leaned forward in anticipation. Some had pulled out recording devices of their own, expecting to capture an amusing demonstration of human technological inadequacy. Professor Vextala raised one of her forearms. When ready, Captain, let us observe the full capabilities of this 15,000-year-old technology. Mitchell drew the bowstring back smoothly, feeling the mechanical advantage of the pulley system multiply his strength. The bow stored 80 pounds of energy, ready to release in a fraction of a second. Through his sight, Corax looked relaxed and amused, completely confident in his natural armor. The human took a deep breath, held it, and found his anchor point. Around the room, 200 alien beings waited to witness what they expected would be a harmless demonstration of primitive human stubbornness. None of them understood what was about to happen. Mitchell's release was smooth and practiced, the kind that came from years of training. The bowstring snapped forward with a sharp twang, transferring all that stored energy into the carbon fiber arrow in less than a tenth of a second. The broadhead flew across the amphitheater in a blur, covering 20 meters before anyone could blink. The impact sounded like a gunshot echoing through the chamber. Corax's expression changed from smug confidence to complete bewilderment in the span of a heartbeat. He looked down at his chest where the arrow shaft protruded from between the scales, the fletching still vibrating from the impact. For a moment, his brain couldn't process what his eyes were seeing. This wasn't supposed to be possible. The silence in the room was absolute. 200 alien beings sat frozen, their minds struggling to understand what had just occurred. The arrow hadn't bounced off. It hadn't been deflected by the scales that could turn aside plasma bolts. Instead, it had punched straight through Corax's natural armor, like it wasn't even there. Green blood began seeping around the arrow shaft, staining the reptilian's chest plates. Corax staggered backward, his massive form swaying as shock set in. His hand moved toward the arrow instinctively, then stopped. Even through his confusion, some survival instinct warned him not to touch the protruding shaft. I don't understand, Corax whispered, his voice barely audible. My scales! They stopped everything. Plasma bolts, cutting beams, kinetic hammers. How did a wooden stick? Professor Vextala's compound eyes fixed on her instruments, mandibles clicking rapidly as she processed the readings. Her scanning equipment had detected no energy discharge from a human weapon, no plasma buildup, no particle acceleration, no exotic matter manipulation. By every measure her technology understood, the bow should have been harmless. Impossible, she breathed, all traces of condescension gone from her voice. Our sensors showed minimal energy output, less than a child's toy. Emergency alarms began wailing throughout the academy. Security drones materialized from hidden panels and walls, their medical scanners immediately locking onto Corax's vital signs. The automated systems had detected a serious injury to a student and were responding with military precision. Mitchell calmly placed his bow on a nearby desk and raised his hands to show he wasn't a threat. Medical assistance is a priority, he said clearly. The arrow missed vital organs, but he needs treatment now. The security drone swarmed around Corax, diagnostic beams playing over his wound. One drone extended a stabilization field around the arrow to prevent further damage if he moved. Another began administering pain medication through a skin patch. The medical response was fast and professional, but the confusion on their sensors was obvious even to the students. Cadet Dissa finally found her voice, though it came out as a crystalline whisper. The scanners can't understand the wound pattern. They're calibrated for energy weapons and exotic matter damage. Around the amphitheater, alien students began pulling out their own scanning devices. The readings made no sense. The arrow had created a perfect cylindrical penetration through scales that should have been impenetrable. No heat damage, no molecular disruption, no electromagnetic interference. Just a clean hole punch through supposedly invincible armor. Captain Mitchell, Professor Vextala said, her voice shaking slightly, please explain what just occurred. Our technology cannot comprehend this result. Mitchell walked slowly toward the front of the room, his movements calm and measured. He could feel the weight of every stare in the amphitheater. These beings had spent their entire lives believing that energy weapons represented the pinnacle of military technology. What they just witnessed challenged everything they thought they knew about warfare. "You're looking at this the wrong way," Mitchell said simply. "Your sensors are designed to detect energy, because that's what your weapons use. Plasma, lasers, particle beams, they all involve converting matter to energy and projecting that energy at a target." He picked up a stylus from the professor's desk and held it up. "But this arrow doesn't use energy conversion. It uses pure mechanical force. When I drew that bowstring back, I stored potential energy in the bow's limbs. When I released it, all that energy transferred into the arrow as kinetic motion." Cadet Zyloff raised her webbed hand tentatively. "But kinetic energy is so primitive, how could it be more effective than plasma?" "Because plasma disperses," Mitchell explained. "When your energy weapons hit armor, they spread their force across the entire impact area. But this broadhead concentrates all its energy on 3 tiny cutting edges, 80 pounds of draw weight focused on a few square millimeters of contact." The medical drones finished their initial treatment and began carefully extracting Korax from the amphitheater on a hover stretcher. The big reptilian was conscious but deeply shaken, still staring at the human in disbelief. "It's just physics," Mitchell continued. "Pressure equals force divided by area. Reduce the contact area enough, and even modest force becomes unstoppable." Professor Vextala looked at her readings again, understanding beginning to dawn in her compound eyes. "You're saying humans never abandoned kinetic weapons because they were more effective than we realized?" Mitchell nodded. "We never abandoned them because they work." The medical hover stretcher disappeared through the amphitheater doors, leaving behind an atmosphere thick with tension and confusion. Mitchell watched the alien students process what they just witnessed. Some stared at their scanning devices, still trying to make sense of readings that didn't match their understanding of physics. Others sat in stunned silence, realizing their entire worldview about primitive civilizations needed serious adjustment. Professor Vextala activated the room's holographic display system, projecting a 3-dimensional model of Korax's wound. The image showed a perfect cylindrical hole through scale layers that had previously been considered invulnerable. Her 4 arms moved frantically across her control interface, calling up comparative data from their weapons testing databases. "Captain Mitchell," she said, her voice carrying a new tone of respect, "please help us understand what we witnessed. Our plasma weapons spread their energy across impact zones, measuring several square centimeters. How does your arrow achieve such concentrated penetration?" Mitchell moved to the center of the amphitheater, positioning himself where every student could see him clearly. "The principle is actually quite simple. Your energy weapons work by heating matter until it breaks apart or melts. That's effective, but it requires enormous amounts of power because you're changing the physical state of whatever you're hitting." He picked up a piece of metal from the professor's demonstration table. "When plasma hits this, it has to heat the entire surface area to thousands of degrees. All that energy gets distributed across a wide impact zone. But watch what happens with focused kinetic energy." Mitchell pulled out a simple ballpoint pen and pressed its tip against a metal sheet. With steady pressure, the pen point began to dimple the surface. Same principle, but on a microscopic scale. The broadhead's cutting edges measure less than a millimeter wide. All 80 pounds of force from the bow gets concentrated on that tiny contact point. Cadet, this crystalline form sparkled as she leaned forward. "But surely modern armor accounts for kinetic impacts? Our defensive systems are rated against projectile weapons." "Against your projectile weapons, yes," Mitchell replied. "But your kinetic weapons use magnetic acceleration and energy fields. They still rely on complex technology that can be countered or disrupted. Human kinetic weapons use pure mechanical force. No electronics to jam, no energy signatures to detect, no exotic materials that might fail." He reached into his equipment case again, this time producing a magazine loaded with rifle cartridges. Several students gasped as he displayed the brass cases topped with pointed metal bullets. "These are from our standard infantry rifle. Each one carries about 40 times more kinetic energy than that arrow. When fired, they travel at nearly 3 times the speed of sound. The physics are identical, massive force concentrated on a tiny impact point. Professor Vextala's mandibles clicked rapidly as she processed this information. Her curriculum had classified human firearms as curiosities, primitive chemical-powered launchers that belonged in museums. The realization that these weapons could potentially outperform military-grade energy systems was staggering. "How many of your soldiers carry such weapons?" she asked carefully. "All of them," Mitchell replied simply. "Every human military unit from basic infantry to special forces. We never stopped using kinetic weapons because they're reliable, effective, and nearly impossible to defend against using conventional methods." Cadet Zyloth raised her webbed hand, her blue skin pale with shock. "What about your bladed weapons? Surely those are ceremonial now." Mitchell smiled and pulled a combat knife from his boot sheath. The blade gleamed under the amphitheater lights, its edge honed to razor sharpness. Every human soldier carries at least one blade. When you run out of ammunition, when your energy weapons fail, when electronic systems get jammed, a sharp piece of steel still works. The alien students began taking notes frantically, their recording devices buzzing with activity. Years of military education were being rewritten in real time. Species that had dismissed humans as technologically backwards were suddenly realizing they'd been catastrophically wrong. "Captain," Professor Vextala said slowly, "are you suggesting that human ground forces could potentially engage galactic military units with primitive weapons?" Mitchell considered his words carefully. The political implications of this conversation were enormous. "Professor, I'm simply demonstrating the physics behind kinetic force. Every military strategist should understand all available weapon systems, regardless of their apparent sophistication." But his meaning was clear to everyone in the room. The galaxy's advanced civilizations had spent millennia perfecting energy weapons, creating elaborate defenses against plasma and particle beams. Meanwhile, humans had quietly perfected weapons that could bypass those defenses entirely. Cadet Drix, an insectoid warrior from the Hive Worlds, spoke up with his buzzing voice. "Our armor is designed to disperse energy impacts. If human weapons concentrate force on microscopic points, then your armor becomes largely irrelevant," Mitchell finished. "Exactly." Professor Vextala's compound eyes studied the human with new understanding. "I believe our weapons assessment protocols require immediate and comprehensive revision. The Academy's entire curriculum may need fundamental changes." Around the amphitheater, 200 alien cadets sat in contemplative silence. Everything they'd learned about human military capabilities had been wrong. The species they dismissed as primitive had been carrying weapons that could potentially neutralize their most advanced defenses. Mitchell returned his knife to its sheath and packed away his demonstration materials. "Physics doesn't care about technology levels, Professor. A sharp stick, properly applied, can be just as deadly as a plasma cannon, sometimes more so." Within 2 hours of the demonstration, every communication channel at the Galactic Military Academy buzzed with urgent messages. The initial report seemed too incredible to believe. A human had seriously wounded a Thavirian warrior using what amounted to a stick and string. Academy leadership demanded video evidence, which only made the situation more alarming when they watched it themselves. Admiral Gorthrex, the Academy's commandant, called an emergency meeting of the senior staff. The Four-Armed Zentorian leader had overseen military education for 3 decades, but he'd never seen anything quite like this. His tactical advisors scrambled to understand the implications, while medical staff confirmed that Corax's injuries were genuine and severe. "Reclassify all human weapon systems immediately," the Admiral ordered. "Everything from their chemical-powered firearms to their bladed implements. If they can do this with a bow, we need to understand what their modern weapons are truly capable of." Meanwhile, in the Academy's medical center, Corax lay propped up in a hospital bed designed for large species. The arrow had been carefully removed, but the wound served as a constant reminder of how wrong he'd been. His thick scales, pride of his warrior heritage, had been penetrated like they were made of soft clay. The medical team had needed to develop entirely new treatment protocols, since their systems were designed for energy weapon injuries. "Captain Mitchell?" Korax called out weakly when he spotted the human entering the medical bay. Mitchell approached the bed cautiously. The Virian warriors were known for holding grudges, and he wasn't sure how Korax would react to seeing him again. "How are you feeling, Cadet?" "Confused," Korax admitted, his reptilian features showing genuine humility for the first time since Mitchell had known him. "My entire life, I was told my scales made me nearly invincible. My family has served as shock troops for generations because plasma weapons barely scratched us. But your arrow went through like you weren't wearing any protection at all," Mitchell finished gently. Korax nodded slowly. "I need to understand how. Not just the physics you explained in class, but everything. How do humans think about warfare? What other weapons do you have that we don't understand? I've been arrogant, Captain. That arrogance could have got me killed in actual combat." Over the following days, word of the incident spread beyond the academy walls. Military strategists across the galaxy began requesting classified reports. Species that had considered humans amusing newcomers suddenly started asking very different questions about Earth's military capabilities. The Galactic Defense Council quietly initiated a comprehensive review of human weapon systems, starting with their kinetic technologies. Professor Vextala found herself in the unusual position of admitting her entire curriculum needed rebuilding. She approached Mitchell with a formal request from the Academy administration. "Captain, we would like to offer you a permanent teaching position," she said during a private meeting in her office. "The course will be called Kinetic Warfare and Applied Physics. We need someone who truly understands these weapon systems to educate our future military leaders." Mitchell accepted, knowing this represented a crucial opportunity for human-alien relations. His first official class drew standing-room-only attendance. Cadets from every species wanted to understand how they've been so wrong about human capabilities. "The biggest mistake you can make in warfare," Mitchell began his inaugural lecture, "is assuming that complex technology is always superior to simple solutions. Humans never abandon kinetic weapons because they work. They're reliable, effective, and nearly impossible to counter with conventional defenses." As the semester progressed, Mitchell noticed fundamental changes in how alien cadets viewed human military doctrine. They stopped seeing Earth forces as primitive and started recognizing them as dangerously innovative. The humans hadn't failed to develop energy weapons. They'd chosen the perfect kinetic ones instead. Cadet Dissa approached Mitchell after one particularly intense lesson on ballistics. "Captain, is it true that human soldiers still use knives in combat?" "Every day," Mitchell replied. "Sometimes the simplest tool is the right tool for the job." The crystalline being's form flickered with what Mitchell had learned indicated deep thought. "We've been so focused on energy output that we forgot about focus application. Your species found a different path to lethality." Throughout the galaxy, military academies began requesting copies of Mitchell's curriculum. The human approach to warfare, emphasizing reliability, simplicity, and devastating effectiveness, challenged everything these civilizations thought they knew about combat technology. In his final report to Earth Command, Mitchell summarized the transformation he'd witnessed. "They expected us to demonstrate the limitations of primitive human technology. Instead, they discovered that their advanced defenses were useless against properly applied physics. A sharp projectile, delivered with sufficient force and accuracy, remains one of the most effective weapons ever devised." Admiral Gorthrex's final assessment to the Galactic Defense Council was even more direct. "Humans don't use primitive weapons. They use perfected ones. The distinction is crucial and potentially decisive in any future conflict." The Academy's new motto, suggested by Korax during his recovery, captured the lesson perfectly. Technology serves the warrior, not the other way around. Sometimes the oldest solutions really were the best solutions. The galaxy was finally beginning to understand why humans had earned their quiet reputation as a species you really didn't want to fight.